Nightfall stretched across the Pacific sky, but inside the barbed wire perimeter of a newly built American prisoner of war camp, time seemed to slow. Dozens of Japanese soldiers, captured after the battles of 1944, trudged forward with their heads lowered, boots dragging through the dust. They had prepared themselves for the humiliation they had been taught was inevitable. In their minds, defeat meant dishonor, defeat meant mockery. And on this walk, shoulders slumped, they braced for the sting of laughter and the weight of insults hurled in a foreign tongue. But what came was not laughter. A silence descended, heavy and deliberate. The American guards who waited at the gate did not jeer. They did not brandish their rifles in arrogance. Instead, as the prisoners shuffled closer, something unexpected happened, something that would etch itself into memory. One American guard, tall and broad-shouldered, stepped forward. His rifle remained slung across his back. And then, before the astonished eyes of men who had been told that their enemy was barbaric, he bowed. Not a shallow nod, not a gesture of mockery. It was a formal bow, deliberate and precise, the kind of gesture Japanese men had made countless times in their own villages, at shrines, and in front of superiors. Only now, it was performed by a supposed enemy, beneath the watchtowers of a prison camp. The Japanese prisoners froze. A few lifted their eyes for the first time, blinking against the late afternoon light. They had expected snarls, insults, perhaps even spittle hurled at their faces. Instead, they found themselves in a moment of surreal solemnity. The guards' posture was not that of conquerors flaunting dominance, but of men acknowledging other men. A ripple of confusion ran through the column. One young soldier clenched his fists, uncertain whether to be insulted or grateful. Another, older and weary, swallowed hard as his vision blurred with tears. For these men, bowing was more than courtesy. It was the vocabulary of respect. And here it was, spoken by the unlikeliest of mouths. In that moment, an unspoken question filled the air like the ringing of a temple bell. Why would the victors lower themselves to greet the defeated? The prisoners could not answer, nor could the guards fully explain. Yet history had made room for this paradox of humanity, a gesture that defied the logic of war. And it is here, in this contradiction, that our story begins. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And let us know in the comments where you are watching from, and what time of day it is for you right now. The year was 1944. Across the Pacific, the tide of war had shifted. The Japanese Empire, once confident of victory, now reeled under the relentless pressure of American industrial might and naval supremacy. Entire islands had fallen. Garrisons had been cut off, and tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers faced the unthinkable fate of capture. For a Japanese soldier, capture meant shame worse than death. In the Imperial Army's code, influenced by Bushido and amplified by wartime propaganda, surrender was a betrayal of the emperor. Mothers were told their sons would fight until the last breath. Commanders expected no man to live in dishonor. Yet by 1944 and 1945, reality shredded ideology. Hunger, exhaustion, and the futility of resistance forced many to lay down their arms. By war's end, over 21,000 Japanese soldiers would be held in American custody, a small number compared to German POWs, but still remarkable given Japan's refusal to surrender until the very last moment. As trucks rumbled into inland America, many of these men found themselves transported thousands of miles away from the battlefields of Saipan, Guam, or Iwo Jima. Behind them were smoking ruins. Ahead, the strange expanse of the American heartland. Camps sprang up across the country in Texas, in California, in the plains of the Midwest. Rows of wooden barracks, guard towers, barbed wire, and organized routines defined life within. But it was not the barbed wire that shocked the new arrivals most. It was the behavior of their captors. The men who had been told Americans were crude, dishonorable, and merciless encountered something that defied their training. Inside the Japanese mindset, defeat meant degradation. They had prepared for jeers. They expected to be spat on. They anticipated being paraded like animals before crowds of civilians. Instead, the first images etched in their memories were greetings delivered with restraint, soldiers saluting as prisoners passed, guards addressing them with commands free of venom. Meals, though plain, served with order. One POW, Corporal Hiroshi Nakamura, later wrote in his confiscated diary that he had braced himself for a gauntlet of shame. "I expected to be struck." His note read, "But they only looked at us as men." His words, scribbled on lined paper and kept hidden in a rolled-up sock, reveal the jarring contradiction. The war outside continued with ferocity. American B-29s rained fire upon Japanese cities. Naval battles churned the waters of the Pacific, yet within the wire of the camps. A different kind of theater unfolded, one where the script was not humiliation, but quiet acknowledgement. Still, confusion clung to the prisoners. Could these Americans be mocking them in subtle ways? Could a bow, so sacred in Japanese culture, be twisted into parody? Suspicion hung in the air, and the prisoners waited for cruelty to surface. But days stretched into weeks, and the expected cruelty never arrived. Instead, a strange, uneasy respect settled into the daily rhythm of camp life. What had begun as paradox now grew into a pattern, and with each encounter, the men who had been trained to despise their captors began to sense cracks in the narrative they had once believed. When the prisoners first stepped inside the camp gates, every man carried a private dread. They had been taught since childhood that capture stripped a man of his very name. Shame was not just personal, it reached back to their families, their ancestors, their villages. Even in the quiet shuffle of boots on gravel, there was the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes, watching and judging. In their minds, the script was already written. Mockery would come swiftly. American guards would sneer. They would be spat upon, perhaps paraded like circus animals. A defeated soldier, in the logic of their world, was beneath even peasants. They were prepared to bow their heads in silence and endure whatever cruelty followed. The air itself seemed charged with expectation. A few whispered to each other in hushed tones, rehearsing how they would keep dignity by not reacting. One prisoner muttered that the Americans would surely laugh at their hunger-thinned bodies or taunt them with food. Another said nothing at all, only clenched his jaw so tightly his teeth ached. Among them was Lieutenant Kenji Sato, a man of stern bearing who had led 30 men during the Saipan campaign. His uniform was tattered, his sword long confiscated, but his pride remained rigid. In his pocket, folded tightly, was a scrap of paper, a farewell note he had once intended to leave for his wife if death found him. He whispered to himself as he walked, "Better to die standing than live kneeling." Yet here he was, marching toward an uncertain fate, braced for insult. The guards stood ahead in formation. Their rifles glinted under the sun, their boots planted firm. A nervous ripple moved through the line of prisoners. The moment of humiliation was at hand. The men lowered their eyes further, shoulders drawn in, bodies tensed like animals about to be struck. But then came silence. Thick, uncanny silence. No jeers, no laughter, no cruelty hurled across the air. The expected sting of shame never landed. Instead, the guards held their ground in stillness, their faces unreadable. A long pause hung between the two groups. Some prisoners dared to glance up. Confusion etched in their eyes. Could it be a trick? Was the humiliation delayed? The silence itself became a torment, as if the Americans were mocking them by not mocking them. That pause would last only moments, but for the prisoners, it stretched into eternity. Every heartbeat pounded against the drum of expectation. And then, one guard moved. His gesture was not a strike, nor a shove, nor a smirk. It was something entirely unthinkable. The guard stepped forward, boots pressing into the gravel with a sound that seemed to echo across the entire camp. Every Japanese prisoner stiffened, bracing for the blow or insult that surely must come. But instead, the tall American, his helmet strapped tight, his rifle slung across his back, stopped, straightened his posture, and then slowly bent at the waist. A bow. It was not shallow or mocking. His hands rested firmly against his thighs, his back dipped at a respectful angle, and his gaze lowered in solemnity. For a moment, the scene looked less like a prison yard and more like a shrine courtyard back home. The Japanese prisoners blinked in disbelief. Their own culture had drilled into them the sacredness of this gesture. To bow was to honor another's humanity, to acknowledge dignity even in defeat. And here, on the soil of the enemy, Their captor gave them the very sign they thought they had forfeited forever. Whispers stirred along the line. One soldier muttered in disbelief, "Are they mocking us?" Another shook his head, unable to answer. Suspicion gnawed at them. Could this be some cruel parody? Yet the seriousness in the guard's expression left little room for mockery. Lieutenant Kenji Sato, who had prepared himself for humiliation, lifted his eyes and felt a tremor ripple through his chest. He had seen fellow officers in Japan scorn their own wounded, had witnessed soldiers dismissed as cowards simply for surviving. And yet, here in captivity, a foreigner extended respect greater than some of his own commanders had ever shown. Behind the first guard, another soldier copied the gesture, then another, soon. A row of American uniforms bowed in silence before men who had expected to be treated as less than human. The air grew heavy, not with cruelty, but with solemn recognition. A young prisoner, Corporal Hiroshi Nakamura, later wrote in a hidden note that tears blurred his vision in that instant. He had sworn never to show weakness, but the sight of the enemy lowering himself in respect was more disarming than any weapon. "I thought my honor was dead," he scribbled. Yet, in that bow, it was returned to me. No command was spoken, no words exchanged. The bow itself became the only language needed. For the first time since their capture, the prisoners stood a little straighter. Some returned the gesture with trembling movements, unsure if they were permitted. In that moment, the boundary between victor and vanquished blurred, replaced by something deeper, a recognition that even in war, dignity could still be given. The silence that followed was profound. It was not the silence of contempt, but of reverence. And, for the prisoners, it was more bewildering than any insult could have been. A paradox had unfolded. The defeated, expecting scorn, were met with honor, and the victors, capable of cruelty, had instead chosen respect. The bow lingered in the air, suspended between disbelief and revelation, for a few heartbeats. No one moved. Then, almost imperceptibly, something broke inside the prisoners, not their pride, but their armor of suspicion. Corporal Hiroshi Nakamura felt his chest tighten. He had prepared himself to endure humiliation with clenched teeth, but the gesture of respect pierced deeper than any insult. He pressed his hands together, his throat dry, and to his own shock, tears began to spill, silent at first, then harder, until his shoulders trembled in full view of both comrades and guards. His fellow prisoners turned toward him, startled. For a Japanese soldier, tears were more shameful than wounds. Yet in this moment, his weeping did not feel like weakness. It felt like release. The camp fell still. American guards did not laugh. They did not mock the crying man. They simply stood, heads bowed, allowing him the dignity of grief. Some Japanese prisoners bit their lips, their own eyes glistening, realizing that what they had expected, cruelty, derision, dehumanization, had been replaced by something far more complex: respect. Lieutenant Kenji Sato, who had sworn never to bend before the enemy, felt his knees weaken. He thought of his wife's letter folded in his pocket, of the last time he had bowed before her father as he asked permission to marry. That same gesture was now given to him by a foreigner in uniform. The irony was sharp, almost bitter, yet it awakened something long buried. He felt seen not as a defeated soldier, but as a man again. The silence of that yard was not empty. It was charged, like the pause after a temple bell fades, when the air itself still hums with memory. What began as tension had transformed into a collective moment of humanity. Later, gossip spread through the barracks. Some claimed the guards had been instructed to perform the bow as psychological warfare, a clever trick to unsettle Japanese minds. Others insisted it was genuine, that a few officers had studied Japanese customs to minimize unnecessary conflict. Arguments rose and fell in whispers at night. But beneath the speculation lay a single truth: the experience had left its mark. For days afterward, men walked differently within the camp. They still carried shame, but not as an unbroken weight. Something had cracked open, a recognition that the enemy they had been taught to despise could act with dignity. And this paradox raises a question I want to ask you, the viewer. If you were among those men that day, what would have stayed with you longer, the bitter memory of surrender, or the silent bow of an enemy soldier who acknowledged your humanity? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes History is not remembered in battles or speeches, but in the moments of silence that change everything. As weeks turned into months, that first bow did not fade from memory. It became a reference point whispered in the barracks, retold during long nights when sleep would not come for the Japanese prisoners. It was the moment when the narrative of the war fractured. They had been raised to believe the enemy was monstrous, incapable of honor, yet here, in the heart of captivity, the enemy had bowed. Small details reinforced this paradox. The food, though plain, arrived on time: bread, beans, sometimes even fruit. See. Guards addressed prisoners with commands, but not with cruelty. When a prisoner fell ill, a camp medic treated him with the same bandages used on American soldiers. These were not the acts of conquerors mocking their captives. They were the gestures of a system that recognized, however grudgingly, the humanity of those inside the wire. Lieutenant Kenji Sato observed this transformation with conflicted eyes. He still held loyalty to the emperor. He still carried shame in his heart. Yet he could not ignore the subtle shifts among his men. Some prisoners began to greet guards with nods. Others traded fragments of English for words of acknowledgement. A few even laughed quietly when a guard, fumbling with chopsticks, tried to mimic their meals. Such moments would have been unthinkable on the battlefield. One American sergeant, a farmer's son from Kansas named Robert Hayes, wrote in a letter to his wife that he had never expected to feel respect for the enemy. "They fight hard, they carry themselves like men," he admitted, "and when I bowed, it wasn't for orders, it just felt right." That letter, preserved in a Midwestern archive, testifies that the gesture was not merely calculated strategy, but also instinctive humanity. Still, not all was harmony. Some American soldiers grumbled that respect was wasted on enemies responsible for Pearl Harbor. Some Japanese prisoners whispered that they would never forgive the firebombing of Tokyo. The war still raged beyond the camp's fences, and its bitterness seeped through. Yet within the wire, a strange experiment unfolded. Enemies locked together in daily routine, learning not through speeches, but through gestures. It was here that a subtle psychological transformation took root. A bow had not ended their hatred, but it had forced reflection. What if everything they had been told about the enemy was incomplete? What if the victor's true strength was not only in tanks and planes, but in their ability to extend dignity? And I ask you directly, watching this story now, do you believe respect can be stronger than weapons? Could a single act of recognition change the course of a man's heart more deeply than any battlefield victory? Share your view, because your perspective carries the same weight as those small gestures once did. Evening settled over the camp one late summer day in 1945. The war was nearing its conclusion, though the prisoners inside did not yet know that Hiroshima and Nagasaki had already changed the course of history forever. In the fading light, a routine exchange unfolded. Prisoners returning from work detail, guards guiding them back through the gates. Nothing seemed unusual, and yet, in that ordinary dusk, something extraordinary occurred. Lieutenant Kenji Sato, his once sharp features now softened by months of captivity, paused before entering the barracks. His eyes met those of Sergeant Robert Hayes, the Kansas farmer's son who had long since become familiar. For a moment, neither man moved. Then, slowly, deliberately, Hayes lowered his head in a respectful bow. The gesture carried no ceremony, no audience, no command. It was quiet, unforced, one man recognizing another. Sato hesitated. The gesture tore at his pride, yet also stirred something deeper. His comrades watched, breath held, waiting to see how their officer would respond. Finally, with the last glow of sunlight on his shoulders, Sato returned the bow, a simple bend of the waist, a gesture he had once given only to his emperor and family elders, now extended to an enemy guard. The camp fell silent. It was not a silence of tension, but of acknowledgement. The exchange spoke louder than any speech. It said that even stripped of power, stripped of weapons, stripped of victory, a man's dignity could still be honored. It said that respect could flow both ways, even between adversaries divided by war. Later that night, prisoners whispered about what they had seen. Some scoffed, saying it was meaningless, just habit from a tired officer. Others admitted that the image lingered with them, the guard and the prisoner, both bowing at dusk, like reflections of each other across the wire. What endured was not the memory of battlefields, but of a bow, a gesture that reached across cultures, across hatred, and across the chasm of defeat. And in this moment, the story takes on a shape larger than one camp, larger than one war. It becomes a message carved into time itself. Weapons may conquer bodies, but only respect conquers souls. History often records its loudest moments, the thunder of artillery, the roar of aircraft, the speeches of leaders that echo across generations. But sometimes, its truest lessons lie hidden in silence. In gestures so small, they almost escape notice. The bow exchange between guard and prisoner was one such moment. It was not a military victory, nor a political declaration. It was simply a recognition, carried in the bend of a spine and the lowering of a gaze. For the Japanese prisoners, it disrupted the narrative of humiliation they had braced for. In that gesture, they glimpsed themselves not as defeated shadows, but as men once more. For the American guards, it affirmed that victory did not have to strip others of dignity. It reminded them that power, when tempered with humanity, carries a weight far greater than fear. Years later, long after the barbed wire had rusted and the camps were dismantled, memories of that bow endured. Some former prisoners would later recall it in hushed tones, as if still unsure whether they had truly seen respect in the eyes of an enemy. Some guards wrote in their letters that bowing had not been an act of weakness, but of strength, a way to end the day without hatred. Perhaps that is the lasting message. Wars will continue to scar the world, and victories will always be measured in territory, numbers, and treaties. But beyond those measures, there are gestures small, human, timeless. A bow at dusk in a prisoner camp reminds us that even in war's darkest hour, the soul of compassion can survive. And so we close with an image: two men, once sworn enemies, bowing to one another beneath a fading sun, a moment when history chose dignity over derision,